Es un honor contar hoy entre nosotros.
We feel very proud to have with us today Scott Stern. Welcome, Professor Stern. And also another person who was cherished by the Foundation, Professor Mercedes Delgado, who will be participating in a conversation with Professor Stern. Scott Stern is, as you know, a very influential person in the field of analysis and innovation. He visits us again for two reasons. On the one hand, because he's going to meet with a network of innovators and entrepreneurs. We've been working on this for the past 10 years within the frontiers of entrepreneurship that the foundation organizes every year with MIT. Thank you very much, Professor, for these 10 years of ongoing support to the Spanish entrepreneurial sector. And also, we are very happy to address the most recent work of Professor Stearns. I'll talk about that afterwards. Professor Stearns is very well known, but let me just very briefly make a reference.
El profesor ocupa la cátedra David Sarnoff de Gestión de la Tecnología en la MIT Sloan School of Management, donde también preside el grupo de tecnología, innovación y emprendimiento y gestión estratégica. Su trayectoria académica y profesional. Perdonen, disculpen. ¿Todo bien?
Yes, I was saying that his trajectory has been focused on understanding how entrepreneurship and innovation differ from traditional activities and how these differences impact the entrepreneurial strategies and policies. Apart from teaching, apart from researching, let me make a reference to some other activities. He has co-founded the MIT Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program. He has participated in the Social Project Interest, and he has also participated in the Entrepreneurship Choice and Strategy textbook. He has collaborated with startups and other many institutions, always thinking about fostering the ecosystems of innovation and entrepreneurship the world over. He is a true defendant of that. As I said, Professor Stern today will talk about entrepreneurship, choice, and strategy. He is co-authored together with another number of professors. This work, which I recommend, offers a comprehensive and detailed explanation of what decisions are to be implemented so that they may successfully overcome the difficulties and increasingly complex realities faced by entrepreneurs. This is a useful tool. It will allow one to transform ideas into something that really affects the market, so effective strategies will be the result. Let me conclude, but before I do so, let me also acknowledge our thanks to Professor Mercedes Delgado. As I said before, she will actually be moderating. She will be taking your questions and making sure that Professor Stern can actually take the questions. She is a recipient of our scholarship. We're very proud of that. She also is a holder of the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship and Innovation, 450 entrepreneurs who really represent a microsystem within Spain. But Professor Delgado has proven her mettle in very many research centers. She has worked with many institutions. She has collaborated with many different universities and research centers. I'm not going to go into either one of their two CVs because what we're here to do is hear them talk and not hear about their achievements. So let me just say that we are very, very happy to have her with us now, Associate Professor of Strategy and Innovation at Copenhagen Business School, CBS, and the Research Affiliate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So let me say once again, thanks to all of your good selves for spending this very warm afternoon with us. Thank you. And we certainly hope that we survive the weather. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Professor Stern, for being with us in Madrid. Thank you for delving into your research. And thank you, Professor Delgado, for always reaching out to help us so that we can foster the ecosystem that we care for here in Spain. Thank you.
Buenas noches. And can we get my slides up? There we go. Perfect. Perfect. Okay. Buenas noches. And first, thank you to the foundation. Thank you to Mercedes. Thank you to all for coming here. I'm just really, really delighted that I'm able to join you, and really privileged to be here this evening. And because this is an entrepreneurship talk, I'm going to take off my jacket. Okay? Only when teaching finance should one wear a jacket. So what I want to do this evening, and I think I'm going to present a little bit for about the next 40 minutes or so, on the kind of core issues of how innovators, how entrepreneurs can go from idea to impact through entrepreneurial strategy, and the role that the entrepreneurial ecosystem plays in shaping that journey. And so to kind of set ideas, I'm going to kind of do a few examples. I'm going to show you a little picture, and I know some of you have had time in Boston. Where is Jean-Jacques? Very good. A man who knows this well. So this is a picture of the area just east of MIT's campus in Cambridge in the late 1970s, which is a long time ago, but not infinitely long ago. And as you can see, there's essentially nothing there. MIT was just to the right of it, and MIT was already a very good university, but as you can see, there was really nothing there. And that's what that area, that same picture looks like today. This is actually from a few years ago now, and there's even more building. And what's interesting about that transformation, one of the largest shifts in kind of urban design in the world, among a developed country, one of the largest shifts, is that all that building, all those new buildings, were not because the government decided to build a big research facility in what we call Kendall Square. And it wasn't because a big corporate, I love corporates, but it wasn't because a single corporate, the Amazon of its time, built a big research lab and sort of came in and created a lot of jobs. Instead, Kendall Square was created by these very curious people we call entrepreneurs, right? And many versions of that, but for example, some of us in the audience, not too many of you, but some of us have just enough white hair to remember Lotus 1-2-3 by Mitch Kapor, right? And even when he founded Lotus 1-2-3, he didn't go out someplace else. He founded it in a new building in Kendall Square, one of these new buildings. And then once that, right, Biogen, one of the early, right, got its founding as a biotech company in the early days of the biotech revolution in the 70s, right there. And then as things kept on going, right, you end up with Akamai, one of the backbone companies for the internet. And then once that process got started, all of a sudden it was like a flywheel. It kept building on itself. And various different types of companies were able to grow up in that. They had access to mentors. Some big corporates started coming in. MIT became increasingly engaged. And Jean-Jacques has a wonderful, who's here with us tonight, has a really wonderful book. Oh, sorry about that. Has a really wonderful book, really telling that history and the new culture at MIT, which I'll return to. But what's interesting about this time is probably most of you have heard of the company on the top left here, Moderna, right, an overnight sensation of a deep science company that obviously had a very big impact during the pandemic, but also companies like PillPack, which I'll talk to you about a little bit later, or BioBot. These are companies that became Amazon Pharmacy, companies that were meaningfully engaged with trying to understand COVID detection in wastewater and one of the most effective remediation strategies during that crisis. And so the question I'm going to ask is, right, and motivated by that, as well as by more general interest in how we build and accelerate innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystems, a few faculty members, Fiona Murray, Bill Aulett, and myself, founded a program at MIT about 15 years ago called REAP. And I think you briefly mentioned that even though I wasn't listening. The MIT Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program. And the goal of REAP is to work with teams around the world to build stakeholder teams that allow them to gain a shared assessment of both the broad opportunities and the challenges in their ecosystem, and then use that moment to drive systematic strategic initiatives that can really make a difference. And we've been fortunate to have actually 3. We work now with more than 90 teams in our global program, more than 150 in various other initiatives around the world, each for about a 2-year period, including 3 from Spain. One right here in Madrid, a great program that we did in Andalusia, and as well in Valencia. And as we were developing those ideas in REAP and trying to help people with that, we came to a kind of foundational insight about building ecosystems and sort of kind of the challenge of accelerating and enabling entrepreneurs, even us as university educators, but also more generally for everyone, whether you're corporate, risk capital, university, foundation. No one is in charge of innovation or entrepreneurship. So if anyone is here from the government, too bad, right? Each of these actors, university, government, corporates, risk capital, play a role in shaping the conditions that allow entrepreneurs to make choices that allow them to accelerate their company. But it's ultimately up to the entrepreneurs and the innovators to build their companies and scale their technology. But their job, remember, is doing exactly that, is building companies, scaling technology, not building ecosystems. And that created a central challenge of how do we bring together communities of stakeholders to meaningfully shift entrepreneurial ecosystems, both in the United States and around the world, including here in Spain. And one of the kind of key, and just to kind of push that, right, is that at the core of REAP were kind of 3 ideas that I want you to keep in mind as we kind of go on this journey, is the role of stakeholders. Once again, no one's in charge. But when we bring people together, very often, if it's for a short meeting, they're almost talking past each other. And so what we need, secondly, is a systematic assessment of that ecosystem, understand the system. And usually, if you can get the stakeholders to trust each other and they're highly leveraged, and they develop a shared understanding of their ecosystem and its strengths and latent strengths and bottlenecks, they're able to identify meaningful strategic initiatives that can really drive impactful change. Everyone so far so good? Okay. One problem with this model, and we'll kind of go through it in a little bit of order, is this model is very, very powerful, but it assumes that we know what entrepreneurs need. And that was the other hat that I and other faculty, including my great colleague Aaron Scott, Josh Gans, really were focused on at MIT over the past decade. Not, right, so here's an ecosystem point of view, but then the question is, how can we actually help entrepreneurs actually move their ventures forward to go from idea to impact? And when I say entrepreneurs, I mean largely, right? I mean, on the one hand, startup companies, new young companies that have the potential for exponential growth, but also the process that we could bring rigorously to establish ventures looking to innovate, looking to create new division, looking to create that next opportunity. And at the core of that was actually a second set of insights that are at the core of, of the book, of this book. Here, you can, right, there you go, there's the book, right? Which is, first, that entrepreneurs have ideas. Ideas are not valuable in and of themselves, but they are important. Not every idea becomes a business, but every successful business is grounded in a real idea. Something you can't create real value and capture some of it on a sustainable basis unless there's some organizing set of ideas that allow you to differentiate yourself from what's already out there. Of course, though, when you start with those ideas, right? When you have those ideas, you don't know much about them. You face uncertainty. And that means that we need to put a proactive approach. And how do we resolve uncertainty? We all learn this in high school or maybe even elementary school. We experiment, we learn. We don't exactly use the scientific method, but we use something like it. We try to test rigorously our most important assumptions in a critical and time-effective way. But if all we did was learn, we would have a lot of knowledge, but we wouldn't yet have a company. And so then we need to translate that learning into choice. We need to translate that into strategy, into the set of choices that an entrepreneur can make that it lets them actually take that idea from zero to impact. I know there were a few, and that's at the core, that simple linkage between nurturing your ideas in a meaningful way, you and your early team, taking a proactive approach to learning and experimentation and being rigorous about it, and then translating the learning to choice and putting choice at center stage is at the center of entrepreneurship, choice, and strategy. And I thank all of you for engaging with it and really delighted to be here. Now, sometimes I call, this is a textbook, and as we were talking, it's not an easy airline read. This is really for undergraduates and MBAs and people in professional programs who are taking a course in entrepreneurship. Sometimes I say there's nothing like a pandemic to write a textbook. We all had a lot of, we had committed to this project, really committed in early 2019, and I kept thinking, how are we ever going to get this done? All three of us are going to need a year at home. We got it. So there we go. And just to kind of give you a sense of what the book is about, let me sort of start with an example, and then we'll kind of try to put these ideas around ecosystems and strategy together. So, here are two students, Michael Martin, who is at the Harvard Business School. Everyone can make a mistake in life, and that was a joke. And Nick Korolick, who is a PhD student at MIT. And Mike and Nick, this is almost a decade ago, actually decided, they met and they became passionate about one idea: mobile-first emergency response. So if I was sitting here and I had a heart attack right now, boom, some of you would say, time to go to dinner and have a canapé and so on and so forth. But some of you might want to save me, and you would pick up your cell phone and you'd call the emergency. What's emergency in? Oh, is it 911 here? Yeah, okay, so 911. And at that time, 911, if you called on a cell phone, just went to a very generic number, kind of in the middle of the state or just general state police, and didn't know where you were, and certainly didn't use the information in your phone, like, who are you? What are your vital signs? Remember, we have these. What's your medical history? Or can we even take video or pictures of what's happening in that most critical emergency? It was easier to call an Uber than it was to call an ambulance. And so once I tell you the idea, right, we're going to solve 911 calls for the smartphone age, then a curious thing happens, and this is true for them, but it's true for every venture that we've ever worked with, is once you have a reasonable idea, you identify a real opportunity, something that has some problem that really needs to be solved. Your problem is not that you can't think of what to do. It's that you can think of too many things to do. You see many options. You see many ways forward. You see different partners you could work with, different resources you might rely on, different ways that you might undertake experiments, different people you might hire, different customers you might serve, different business models you might try. Just to kind of give you a sense of that, and this was, right, at that time, these are real example, is for example, they went around to different advisors around Harvard, MIT, or MIT ecosystem, and some people said, oh, you want to be in the emergency response business, what you need to do is work with Motorola. Motorola is, even today, the largest provider of the technology in emergency response systems around the world. They have a few competitors in Europe and various things, but they're the dominant player still. That was one option, right? They said, you have some technology you're developing. Nick was a PhD student in nuclear engineering and computer science, and he had sort of figured out something. Michael had understood kind of how to get into the systems, and maybe you just go and work with the Motorola. That was one option. A second option was that in response to a pitch event, an insurance company called Michael and said, we will pay you $1 million right now if you work on an emergency response for our insurance app. No one opens their insurance app for good reason, right? You use it maybe to pay your bill, maybe make a complaint, file a claim, but no one likes insurance. Sorry if there are people from insurance here, right? Right? But you don't kind of like scroll through your insurance company's website, right? Just for fun. And so they said, this is going to be a good value add for us, and it could save us cost if we actually works. And we're willing to give you money right now. And they just graduated, right? They had loans. This was a meaningful option, paying customer. They went to Silicon Valley. And some people said, this is Uber for ambulances. Why don't we'll give you a lot of money, much more capital intensive than this other thing. We're going to make a platform and we're going to privatize the public service and then sell it back to the government. Some of you might know Peter Thiel. Right? You can imagine that's his philosophy, right, in companies like Palantir, right? You might agree or disagree, but it's a strategy and it's been very successful in certain cases. Right? And then finally, they had this other customer that they called their burning platform customers that didn't have any money but had passion. These were advocacy organizations that desperately, people who, the American Epilepsy Society, anti-domestic violence groups, who think about whose constituencies think about emergency response all the time. And the only thing I want you to consider is that with a small idea, once again, they had the basic idea of, we should fix this problem through technology. And we think there's nothing technically that should stop us, but it's going to take a lot of work to get there. So there was a lot of uncertainty, but they had a real idea, and they could see multiple paths forward. Entrepreneurial strategy is the choices that we make between alternative paths for an idea and company. Now let me add one more lesson in there, is that who they trusted, who they take as their advisors and mentors, depended a little bit on which strategic alternative they might choose. So just to give you one example from our MIT ecosystem, is that if they went with the insurance app, that would be something where it would be very helpful to work with people who knew how to do contracts and develop relationships and to build a meaningful relationship, B2B, in an exploratory platform. And we have a program at MIT that's really good called the MIT Startup Exchange, whose sole goal through the Industrial Liaison program is that. That's all that the Startup Exchange does. It helps startups that want to work with big companies to get advice about how to do that if they don't have experience. We're in so far so good? On the other hand, if they wanted to work with their burning platform groups, and it'd be hard to work, right? Remember, the company was willing to pay them $1 million, but they don't want them working on other things on the side. So this is a choice, right? If you want to work with the burning platform groups, then the appropriate mentor is something like our Martin Trust Center for MIT Entrepreneurship, headed by Bill Ollett, right? Where there's a very intensive approach on actually getting out there, working directly with final customers, really understanding that customer journey, and just kind of iterating that process. And that's a really valuable thing as well. On the other hand, note, it's hard to listen to both of those pieces of advice, right? Because there's going to be different answers. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. And so, what are we going to focus on? How can a startup choose a path to create and capture value from their idea? What does that mean to make choice matters through a process of learning experimentation leading to choice? And how does the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in Madrid, around Spain, anywhere, enable distinct and effective entrepreneurial strategy? One last tool I want to mention, and I'll come back to it, this is just a bit of a preview, is that a core insight that we had was that most of the time in entrepreneurship, there's not one right answer. If you're pursuing a good idea, there's probably multiple ways to win. And if you talk to different people, they're going to give you different advice, right? Do you have something like Shark Tank here? Right? Kind of, you know Shark Tank, right? The great thing about Shark Tank is, right, somebody comes out, pitches their ideas, and the different sharks disagree with each other. Some think the venture is great, some think it isn't so great, and the advice they give is very different and kind of reflects who they are. Mark Cuban always thinks it should be a tech company that he could scale in Silicon Valley, and this is the US version, Lori Greiner, she's the woman from QVC, the shopping channel, always thinks about a kind of direct-to-consumer marketing plan, right? You're green, right? And so that part of that there's an insight that rather than there being a single path to value, that basically the process of experimentation is meant to surface alternatives, meant to surface meaningful choices, and then usually leaving one behind in order to pursue one, at least for the time being. And that's a practical tool we've used again and again with startups, both at MIT and around the world. At the core of that process is how do you get to surface those multiple alternatives, is the notion that we should be sharp and rigorous in our entrepreneurial experimentation. We have great entrepreneurs at MIT. We're really blessed with some of the best students in the world. As we've been discussing, President Trump seems to be not so enthusiastic about that plan anymore for some of our universities. But we have some of the best students in the world. But interestingly, the art and science of entrepreneurial experimentation is something that even the very best entrepreneurs, even the best students, find it difficult to learn. And I'll give you an example. We have many students who will say, oh, they've been grinding on their startup for weeks. And I ask them, what have they done? And they'll say, I did a large-scale study between 38 different colors for the website. And I've picked hot pink. And let's be clear, that's a thing you can do, but it probably doesn't address your most critical issue, right? And usually if you point it out to them, they say, oh, right, I kind of got diverted, I didn't quite. And if you surfacing what is the most critical test, critical hypothesis that would be the make or break of this venture? What hypothesis do you need to validate that says it's worthwhile spending the next 5 to 7 years of your life on this initiative? How do I get meaningful feedback about that hypothesis with fidelity, in a way that's accurate, unbiased, that lets me see what's really going on? And how do I do that in a timely manner that doesn't bankrupt me with meaningful opportunity cost? Just to kind of highlight some things from the book, we highlight some ideas. What are we trying to do when we surface alternatives? At Amazon, there's a famous distinction in decision-making between one-way door versus two-way door decisions. A one-way door is you can't go the other way out, right? A two-way door, you can step on through and come on back out. Good entrepreneurial experiments is the art of taking a peek through the one-way doors. Saying, I'm not going to be able to see everything, but is it favorable in there or not? Is there a nice garden? It looks kind of nice. Or is there a big tiger that's about to eat me out there? You see what I'm saying? Right? Test small. One way to do that is testing small to choose big. Nothing can be true in general unless it's true somewhere in particular. If an entrepreneur tells me, or a new initiative at a company says, everybody's going to like this, I say, who in particular? What's a meaningful customer segment that can allow us to actually test, are you creating a real value? Well, one reason for that is, as a startup, but even as a bigger organization in a new initiative in a bigger organization, is innovation and new product development and new initiatives is you're asking something very big from customers. You're asking them to change their behavior. And that's a tough ask. If you look at your own life, and this is probably a crowd that's very, right, kind of adaptable and up with the latest technology, most of us, 98% of our purchases from last month are the same as this month. Right? We mostly have very cyclical patterns of what we value and buy with our scarce resources. You see what I'm saying? On the other hand, when you're asking so you have to create compelling new value for some group, and that doesn't guarantee that it will scale, but it's at least a first order test of whether or not you're creating meaningful value for somebody. Right? And learning, and to do that, one of the things we learned is that it's valuable to have founders, have innovators, write down and state clearly what those assumptions are. So if they have people say, oh, I'm kind of learning, whatever, that turns out kind of an iterative approach, helpful, good, but not as good as writing it down. It turns out that having the founding team, maybe 2 or 3 members, maybe an early stage investor, agree on what the most critical test is, critical hypothesis, how they're going to test it, turns out to have a significant impact on firm performance. There have been a number of very careful studies done, literally looking at how do things emerge when they just, people kind of iterate on the fly versus writing things down. Okay. But regardless of which tricks you use, the outcome of experimentation is still a little subtle. Because rather than resulting in a single path, one right answer, most of the time what entrepreneurial experiments do is they show you more and more, if you're pursuing something that's good, it's going to show you more and more possibilities. It's going to surface multiple alternatives. And so the process of experimentation validates the potential of the idea, but still leaves open multiple paths to value. And so, as I mentioned before, the core of what we then do is try to give students a concrete way to first undertake that experimentation and then proactively make those meaningful choices. And what do I mean by that? Well, we try to organize around some core choices, choosing your customers, choosing your technology, choosing your organization, and choosing your competition. And then we see how all of those choices come together as part of an overall entrepreneurial strategy. So Our customers, of course, have to choose us. But at the earliest stages of venture, if we surface multiple potential beachheads, not just one, our choice of which beachhead to focus on is choosing our customers and affects what maybe the next market is and who we're influential on and what challenges we face in the future. And then, kind of using that, we then see how those choices come together as part of an overall entrepreneurial strategy using a framework we call the Entrepreneurial Strategy Compass. So this graphic is, and let me just make sure this is going to work. Oh, well, I guess it doesn't. Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, that's good. Okay, great. Is that this is a compass, not a map. And what I mean by that is that you and your ideas are in the center. It's not telling you, oh, figure out which quadrant you're in, and we'll tell you what to do. It's saying you are the decision maker at the center, just like a compass, right? North, south, right? And then we have these two dimensions that frame with whom and how you compete. Essentially the choice of competition that Mercedes, I think, might ask me a question about later, right? That then crystallize some key strategic alternatives. So for this compass, the horizontal x-axis is the choice between, are you oriented towards collaboration with the big firms in the industry or competition with those very same firms? Right? That's a key choice. Right? Are you kind of more oriented towards a collaborative approach or more competing with those very same firms? On the horizontal axis is the choice between whether or not you're a firm that prioritizes control over the idea or just executing and iterating on that idea. Is it a get-ahead, stay-ahead kind of model? Or is it kind of a more foundational intellectual property, trade secrecy, proprietary architecture? And we see that as a core issue. And just kind of, I'll put a little bit of content on that, right? So for example, we had two students, Elliot Cohen and TJ Parker. They actually got together during a hackathon. Elliot was a student in our MBA program. TJ was at the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy. He was a pharmacist. He came from a pharmacy family. And in that competition, they came up with what everyone agrees was a good idea. For those of you, some of us are as we get older, or if you have your parents, my dad and mom, for many years, they spent their entire day in retirement organizing my dad's pills. What to take when. They had many bottles, right? And they would then argue about it for many hours, as best as I could tell. Maybe that was a good thing, but so it goes, right? Is that when you face multiple medications, and particularly as you get older, you don't know exactly what to take when, what's the whole plan? And they came up with a very elegant solution, is that rather than starting with a whole bunch of bottles, then trying to figure it all out, you should just have what they called a pill pack. That says it's 8 a.m. on Sunday, take these pills. Problem solved. And everyone agreed this was an elegant solution. But the question is, how to go from that idea to building a company. And we actually wrote a case on PillPack basically 3 or 4 weeks after they incorporated the company. So it was very, very early. And as we were talking, they said, well, it was very clear to them that a central choice that they had to make was that some advisors told them, you have such a great innovation for the pharmacy industry, retail pharmacy, you should make sure to position yourself to be bought out by a big pharmacy, CVS or Walgreens, right, in the United States. I'm sure there's, right, other things here. So that sounded pretty good. Then they go to other advisors and say, this is a great idea. In fact, it's so great that the last thing you should do is work with CVS or Walgreens. And the reason is because they're dinosaurs, they'll be too slow, they're not going to be committed to it, they care about in retail pharmacy, not online, so on and so forth. And they said what your job should be is to position yourself as a competitor to CVS and Walgreens. I will say about 5 years later, I remember in 2019, in June, they were ultimately acquired by Amazon for $1 billion. It's a good day. Okay, everyone agree that's a pretty good outcome, right? Worth for 5 years of work, right? What was more interesting was it was an otherwise quiet day on the stock market, which is not how we have it these days, but so it goes, right? And the market cap of Amazon, which at that time had no presence in pharmacy, went up $20 billion. But the market capitalization of CVS and Walgreens, the competitors, was reduced by $12 billion. So that was basically TJ and Elliott became were the team that then founded and scaled within Amazon Pharmacy, that is now the third largest pharmacy in the United States, all online. Everyone so far so good? Collaboration versus competition. The other is control versus execution. A student, and she was down in New York after graduation. She'd been at Sloan, and she actually was unhappy in her job, so she didn't yet have an idea, and she gave herself 2 weeks to think of an idea that she thought could make a very big company, which I'm not sure is exactly how to do it, but she took 2 weeks, rather than go on vacation, that's what she did. But interestingly, she didn't quite know how to do that. She didn't really have many mentors at that point. And so she was a very good dancer. And kind of she liked going to the gym. And so she was spending a lot of her time booking different appointments at different gyms and dance, places to, do dance classes. And as she was doing that, she said, oh, this process is crazy. Why can't I get access to all these studios for one pass, right? The studios have extra room in their classes. Everything is on paper and fax machines, and it's very awkward. Why can't we make that seamless and really serve the customer and actually make it better for the studios as well? Everyone so far so good? And that created ClassPass. And what's interesting is that when that idea came out, it was not surprising that she had no patent on the concept of you can get access to many gyms. And people said, how are you ever going to make money? Where's the competitive advantage? Michael Porter would be very upset with this idea, right? There's no core, right? And she said, I am going to be relentless about executing on this idea. I'm ahead, and I'm going to get ahead, and I'm going to stay ahead. And that's exactly what she did, and built it into a successful IPO about 8 years later. That business faced lots of problems during COVID, right? But until that moment was extremely growth. Okay, so now what we're going to do is I'm going to bring back those, right? So we're now going to use that entrepreneurial strategy compass to look at the choices that we talked about at the beginning around Rapid SOS. Okay, right? Motorola, right? That's sort of something like our, right? That's like they're going to collaborate with the big guys and control, right? It's all about IP. Versus a more team-oriented approach, execution with collaboration with the insurance company, control and compete. That's the kind of Peter Thiel, big architecture, right? A new architecture for the industry, and the kind of let's hustle and get it done and find real customers, right, immediately, and really serve right, these people they don't have a lot of money, but they have a passion for the problem. That's right, this disruption strategy. And that's at the core of this entrepreneurial strategy compass, is that each of the different quadrants, each of the different areas is going from the center, give you a kind of playbook for the types of customers you might serve, the types of technology you might develop, how you might organize your team, and how you're going to get to market, and how to compete. Everyone so far so good? And so a key piece of that, though, and I'm just going to add this, is that we should also be thinking, because I know many of you here are enabling entrepreneurs, is to see how these different strategies relate to different ecosystem resources. So, let's look at a strategy. I always start with the intellectual, so just how we have it. So, right, so we have this compass. When we go control, collaborate, we're going to call that an intellectual property strategy, right? And then if we kind of do exactly the opposite to the bottom and the right, execute and compete, we'll call that disruption. Execution and collaborate, we're going to consider that a value chain strategy, and control and compete is going to be called, we're going to call an architectural strategy. So let's look at each of those in a little bit more detail. And Mercedes, I have about 7 minutes. Yeah, something. Yeah, from when we started. Yeah. Okay. I just want to make sure, I can go as long as you want. We have a whole class. Okay. Okay. So when I think about intellectual property strategy, right, that's where I'm sort of an ideas factory. I'm thinking about a small group, maybe technologists, innovators, maybe a few business development people, and I have to transfer technology seamlessly to my partners, right, who then serve their final customers. Interestingly, if your idea is that the established firms are going to figure out what to do with your technology, the one that, like a university professor might, you're never going to make any money. It's actually incumbent in an intellectual property strategy to have a key hypothesis how you can deliver value for that firm's existing customers or kind of very high priority new customers, right? You might say, that sounds pretty hard. It is. But think of Ray Dolby. Ray Dolby was one of the most successful entrepreneurs of the 20th century, right? Household name, never produced a product. Just created stream standards and worked with the industries very purposefully. He chose not to serve the final customer. It was all through the first audio and then video and film companies. And he kind of created his engineer's paradise. He was tough but fair in negotiations, and he figured out how to get those technologies scaled through working with the bigger players throughout the industry. When he died, he was worth several $1 billion, which doesn't show that an intellectual property strategy always works, but it is an example of it actually working. We had a great startup come out of MIT that's still scaling, LiquiGlide. They went through our summer accelerator in the Trust Center. They got right, and this is the one, some of you might have seen this video. They kind of squeeze out the ketchup and it comes out immediately. Right? It's kind of a slippery surface. And they got a lot of advice. Oh, you need to be in the ketchup industry. And they said, actually, no, we're pretty sure we can patent this technology, license it out of MIT. And then we create a platform that we could then work with a lot of industry partners. And then about 2 years later, they found the perfect first partner, Elmer's glue. So do you have Elmer's glue here? Do you know what that is? That's like the key glue for arts and crafts projects. So when you think about the glue industry, right, the key technology is you take a sticky bottle, a toothpaste or ketchup, and it comes out immediately, and everything comes out of the bottle. And the thing is that the stickiness of ketchup is sort of incidental to ketchup. It's not central. But the glue industry faces a big problem. It's trying to sell you on the proposition that the thing inside that bottle will stick to everything except the bottle that it's currently in. Right? And so once they understood that was their perfect test case, and then they figured that out and built a portfolio of industry partners through this IP strategy. Interestingly, within our Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program, we had a team from Iceland. And what they understood was that a lot of Icelandic entrepreneurs, they were developing very cool, what we would now call deep tech, but the IP process wasn't very good. And about 70% of the entrepreneurs that they were talking about didn't care about that because they didn't care about tech transfer. But for the 30% who cared, the fact that the process didn't work was a big thing. And that's, right, Mercedes, right? And so what they did is they actually passed a law. I mean, Iceland is a small place, so passing a law is basically having a meeting about this size, a group of people. But they passed a law that merged all the underfunded individual offices at each university, created a centralized office that actually had professional expertise in technology licensing, and then all of a sudden that served those entrepreneurs who wanted to facilitate that intellectual property strategy. Does that kind of make sense? All right. Okay, now let's think about another strategy disruption. Rather than delivering value for existing customers, this is about hustlers, about creative destruction, the lean startup. This is about discovering value, customer discovery, discovering value for new users. Hopefully, customers that the established firms don't even care about, right? So it's like exactly the opposite type of customer, right? Think of Salesforce. When Mark Benioff founded Salesforce, he left Oracle. He knew he wanted to be a CEO. Larry Ellison didn't look like he was going anywhere. And so he looked at what Oracle did really, really well, and he looked at all their core choices and said, we're going to do exactly the opposite. Core customer for Oracle is a Fortune 100, huge institution, even government, large hospital system, something like that. No. Salesforce is for those medium-sized businesses where Oracle doesn't even want to take that business. Oracle, of course, gives you the proprietary customized solution. I'm sure some of you have worked with that. Salesforce, you get 80% of the functionality for 20% of the cost, but it's all standardized. Do you see what I'm saying? Rather than everything being on site with a customized team, it's all in the cloud, software as a service. We have great disruptive companies that come out of MIT. Mercedes and I are privileged to have worked very extensively with Ministry of Supply. They created a new category of essentially fashion tech, of essentially having shirts and basically being able to wear more flexible materials in men's dress wear or for office wear, not just for the gym. And when they undertook that, they just were scrappy, and they did rapid experimentation and testing. And one of the key things was that the more established firms, think of Brooks Brothers, saw MIT students doing fashion. They didn't need to worry, right? Because for Brooks Brothers, right, traditional men's retailer, that's about fashion, not tech. The customer that they ultimately served were people who needed to dress up for the office but hated doing so. And so they were willing, and they built out a very successful venture with that. Here what we see are, I'm sorry, that was a little blurry, is in many of the accelerators and activities that we see come out of, for example, things we do within our REAP program, we see people particularly emphasizing for students, for young people, these kinds of disruptive strategies, rather than try to get into the industry and do 75, kind of complicated transactions. Let's find who's the most passionate here, jump onto that, and see if we can serve them, and we'll figure about profitability later. Discovery rather than control. Okay? We can say the same thing about value chain. This is still, right, where we're now executing, but in collaboration. Actually empirical, right? Now we're discovering value, but for existing users. This is the world of teams, right? This is the world of something like Stripe, right? The Collison brothers, some of you know Stripe, not everybody, right? I had thought that payment systems had been solved since PayPal. Well, it turns out not so much. And they just did the painstaking job of aligning and figuring out with each vendor exactly how they could provide something so that that payment layer, that single payment layer, just worked, right? And they built out one of the most profitable enterprise, one of the most valuable enterprises of the last decade, I think in its most recent round, estimated around $50 billion. Right? We see, I mentioned BioBot before, right? They got lots of different things they could do with their wastewater treatment, and all of a sudden, what did they do? I'm getting there, yeah, okay, right, all right. What did they do? They worked with local government. And once they had that collaborative relationship actually in the domain of opioids, they were able to take that and with COVID, then scale up very quickly to really provide a solution. Okay. We could also talk about architectural strategy. This is more that 0 to 1. This is now where we're almost creating a new platform, a new entire system. Think here of, for example, Open Table. Right, we experience Open Table as something for us when we make reservations. What the team understood very early on was they actually had to solve restaurant operations, because your reservations determine what you do in the restaurant. How do you set up the tables? How many staff? Even what's on the menu, right? If it's a romantic night out, different menu than group dinners. And so that was a kind of reshaping of an entire platform, bringing together, right, the entire ecosystem in a new way. Okay, we're almost done. Don't worry too much about the details. I promise we'd be happy to provide these and various other materials. But the key is that these different entrepreneurial strategies involve different priorities and commitments. Okay, let me just take 3 more minutes. Is that okay? Yeah, okay, we're getting there, right? And so what do I want to say? So let me go back to, just if it's okay, right? Rapid SOS, okay? So within Rapid SOS, right, they had this key moment. They thought about these choices. They were talking to different mentors. And in some sense, the choice of strategy was also a choice of which resources in their ecosystem to access, which mentors to bring on board, how to go about that venture in the next stage. They ultimately had this key insight that those burning platform customers is if it could work there, it might work everywhere. And if it didn't work there, they should probably cut their losses and maybe take that job at McKinsey, or in the case of Nick, right, maybe go into academia. And so they did that, and they were very successful. They did that they chose not to do the other things. They focused in on those burning platform. Here we are, kind of working with, that was the entire company at the time, right? And then, once they did that, about 2 years later, Tim Cook wakes up, and he realizes that when people have harm because they can't get through to emergency response, they don't blame 911, they blame Apple. So he went to these same groups, and they said the only other person who's really talked with us is Mike and Nick, and their great solution that we love. And so that allowed them to form a very fulsome partnership, first with Apple, and then with Google and Android, and we're able to scale up that in an important way. And so let me just, there's no sound? No. Okay, so this is actually was a Super Bowl commercial. It's very dramatic, but rather than, we didn't check the sound. Okay, and so what they've been able to do is now they are within the United States on every single cell phone. They serve about 600 million more devices. They handle more than 160 million emergencies per year. And the only premise of the company is they look at financial profitability and lives saved as their 2 core principles. Okay. How do I want to finish up? Is when we started this journey, what we were trying to do was provide an actionable framework that allowed innovators and entrepreneurs to go from idea to impact, to link the choices they make to the firm they want to build. And as a kind of higher level, for those of you who are enabling entrepreneurs, enabling innovators, building out initiatives in existing firms, let me emphasize the importance of each of those stakeholders, those different ecosystem resources, in helping those entrepreneurs go from idea to impact. Thanks a lot. Great. And my apologies for going a little bit over.
So it's a huge pleasure being here today with Scott Stern for many, many reasons. One is that he's a very dear co-author and colleague, and so double play. Let some people move around. Yeah. And I have used this incredible book in all my entrepreneurship teaching for life science students, design students, executive MBA. So it's a very powerful framework. And I feel very lucky that our own community of entrepreneurs here in the foundation have been also part of testing this framework.
Absolutely.
So very, very exciting indeed. And many of you have sent me questions through the Scott's presentation, so thank you about that. I'll choose a few of them. But first I'm going to do a few of my questions and then I'll take yours. Okay, I have here yours with me. The first, I guess, basic question is why writing this book? And did MIT influence the way you think about entrepreneurship and the implementation of the book?
So when I was very fortunate that I was hired as a faculty member at MIT in 1995, which is probably older than some of you are. In fact, I'm sure that's true. And I was faculty member there for 6 years. I then moved to the Kellogg School at Northwestern for about 8 years. That's actually where I met Mercedes. She was on a foundation fellowship, and then we started work together. And then I moved back to MIT in 2009. And when I moved back to MIT, I moved back for basically one purpose. I didn't tell people at the time. It was basically to think about this. Was at that time, the idea that strategy mattered for startups was a dirty word. People said, oh, people should just guess, or it's a mystery. It's a lightning in a bottle entrepreneurial success. There's no systematic way to do it. And I was pretty sure that wasn't true because it seemed if your ideas were important and you didn't have a lot of resources, then what did you have but strategy, if you see what I'm saying, right? And so I started this class, Entrepreneurial Strategy. I think it was the first course that was called that. And then, of course, Joshua came on board and with great help from Fiona, and then Aaron over time as we built up our team. And then the reason we wrote this particular book was we realized that there are some really great books. Our good colleague Bill Allet's Disciplined Entrepreneurship Framework. For those of you who know the Lean Startup, there's lots of books you can buy at the airport for people who are currently existing entrepreneurs. But interestingly, there hadn't really been an attempt to bring that together, take the kind of core great insights from all those different frameworks, from practice, from our academic, and bring it into a unified framework that would allow classrooms to be rigorous and focused on the most important issues in an effective way. So that was the kind of core motivation.
And I like, it's also in the title, right? It's about choices, choice and strategy. And you think about it as an entrepreneur, you have very few resources. But actually thinking about your strategy is free. And it turns out that it's a very powerful tool. So why choices matter for entrepreneurs?
Right. I mean, so one, as you've already said it, is that thinking is hard to do, but it's free, right? It doesn't cost you money, right? And more importantly is that I think there had been that sometimes when you hear a big success story, right? A Steve Jobs or even a Salesforce or whatever it is, people say that's the only path available. I have to do exactly what Steve Jobs did. And that's hard to do because most of us aren't Steve Jobs and right, his unique characteristics. Do you see what I'm saying? And then what we would see even more was that different mentors, different people giving advice, even different classrooms, would be giving different advice to the same entrepreneurs. People come into our offices, and Aaron, my great colleague Aaron says, the people come in and say, who's wrong? Who's right, who's wrong? And the answer is that different people would have different theories of success. And that led to a really key insight, which is if you are pursuing a good idea, there are very likely multiple paths to value. It's the nature of good ideas that there's multiple ways to win. But you can't pursue them all. And that means that if you surface those ideas and understand, oh my goodness, if I go that more cooperative route, that's going to involve a lot of business development. I probably have to talk to a lot of lawyers, right? If I go that more disruption route, I face the threat of the big guys swooping in at some point and really competing, so on and so forth. Yep.
I really like the idea that you can choose competition, right? We're so used to think about, oh, we choose the customers, we choose the technology, we choose our team. So I think it's particularly powerful what you just described, that you can choose how to compete. Who are your competitors?
Right. Now, to be clear, you don't get a choice to face no competition. The only time you face no competition is when you produce a terrible product or platform that no one uses. You won't get a lot of imitation then. So that's number one, right? So, but once you pursue something valuable, you will face some competition, but your prior choices shape the nature of that competition. If you've positioned yourself for that more collaborative framework, guess what? Then you're competing to be the preferred vendor to the industry. If you chose that more execution-oriented, you're competing on the basis of your capabilities rather than the, kind of proprietary nature of the original idea. That then becomes table stakes for the industry.
And you illustrated very well with many examples like PillPack. So I also find very powerful this concept that when you have a very good idea, there are many potential commercialization paths. And to choose the right one, you need to do experimentation, learning, testing. What is the right way to do experimentation? Or what will you tell entrepreneurs not to do when they're doing experimentation?
So the one thing, I would layer that in a few different ways. The first and most important thing is to be clear what's an experiment and what's a choice, right? If your experiment is going to take 2 years, is going to involve putting out a product on the marketplace, that's going to involve building a team of 20 people, and is sort of running the business, guess what? You will learn from that experience in your lifetime, but you've now made a choice. Did you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's the venture, right? That's what you're doing. So the first is I would distinguish between, to be really clear, what are we doing to learn, and what are we doing to scale, right? What are we doing to figure things out, and what are we doing to sort of architect the business? That's number one. The second principle is, I would say, that is the value of writing it down. And once again, I'm not sure exactly how formal it needs to be, but I've been struck by the very systematic empirical evidence that's been accumulating just in the last 5 to 7 years, motivated by this work and work by some colleagues at Bocconi, some work that you've done, right, around at Copenhagen Business School, that where academics have gone, given different training programs to different entrepreneurs, and kind of seen what works. And I briefly showed there's a great program at the University of Toronto, the Creative Destruction Lab, that, for example, really sharpens those most critical assumptions for entrepreneurs. And that program is now, the ventures that have gone through that program are associated with about $50 billion of market capitalization over the past decade, which is pretty good, okay? And then the only other thing I'd say, is it okay if I'd say one more thing?
Absolutely.
Right? And the third is that recognize your own biases.
Okay.
I don't know if entrepreneurs are optimistic in general. They probably are, right, relative to the average in the population. But I can guarantee you one thing. Entrepreneurs are optimistic about the idea they are pursuing, or else they wouldn't pursue it, right? An entrepreneur believes, right, when they get started, they probably believe in that idea at its moment of inception more than anyone else, or almost anyone else. And the reason is, or else somebody else would have pursued it, right? But that has many consequences. For example, it means that very often your early team will be the crazy people who have the same crazy beliefs that you do, which is a little bit different than going to a more established VC or, right, just an employee who just wants a job. And then the last part of that affects how you interpret evidence. There's a difference between the kind of things that persuade yourself versus the kind of tests and experiments that would, for example, persuade a venture capitalist or a potential employee or supplier or customer.
I think, again, and I like this idea, write down your experiment and be very aware that as an entrepreneur, you're going to be biased because you already have an idea where you want to go, it may be the wrong direction. Be very conscious about those biases, using the right method. Great practical insight. Now I'm going to draw a little bit on my research. One thing that I've been investigating in the last 5 years is that women are underrepresented in innovation, in entrepreneurship, and not only in Spain, but this is a problem in the whole world. But in your book, you give us a great example of female entrepreneurs. So my question to you is, how can we become better in including female talent into entrepreneurship? You have some advice.
Right. So I'd make 2 or 3 points. So the first is that if every entrepreneurship class just is stories about Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, interestingly, that might be inspiring to some people, but interestingly, by and large, it really selects out on gender, on race, on other characteristics. People are much more motivated. So what I've learned in class is I could tell you many stories classically about famous companies that did the cooperation compete. But if you're in the classroom, the fact that Elliot Cohen was in that seat 5 years ago, that makes a big difference. Or that Kit Hickey in Ministry of Supply, a female entrepreneur, and she comes to class and says, I was sitting exactly where you were, and I had no money, I had no experience as an entrepreneur, but I had this idea, and then we built the company. That motivates much more. So I think that being explicit and thoughtful about how we choose our examples to illustrate to our students and to illustrate to early stage startups what's possible. And then the second part of that, I think, is you have to think through, but that doesn't solve every problem. We have I think you know her, Alexis Durant St. James, who probably founded the first female-focused deep tech venture fund in the world, because it's been around for like 15 years, and I don't even think people had those terms in 2008 when she founded it. And her thesis is that women face discrimination, based on her own experience as an entrepreneur and an investor, women face lots of discrimination in later stage funding rounds. And that leads in the early stage funding rounds, people be very skeptical. So they're like, in the later stage, you're going to face all this discrimination. And so what she built was a fund that was actually premised on her fund providing the core for multiple stages of these deep tech ventures. So sort of scaffolding ventures that could work but need an ecosystem, a supportive ecosystem around them, is key to, I think, making the most inclusive use of our great human talents from all.
And we have great female entrepreneurs in our community, and you're saying those are real, they could be mentors, they're great examples to motivate future female entrepreneurs. I see a lot of female entrepreneurs also here in this audience, so it's great to have you here. And I know you've been a great advocate for female and entrepreneurship, so thank you for doing that, continue doing that. Now I have a question that is almost you cannot avoid these days. There is huge uncertainty. We have a lot of frictions to trade with a big market, the US market. We also have frictions to collaborate with top research universities in the US. So what will be your advice to the Spanish innovation ecosystem to respond to these shocks, to this uncertainty?
Well, I'll put a few layers on that. So one, as an economist, tariffs, it's sort of like sin against humanity. Every time I hear about the tariffs, then of course they get removed by the afternoon, so it's not clear what to do. I think that, I hate saying this because I'm a big believer in the value of the U.S. entrepreneurial ecosystem, some of the great work we've done, I'm saying the kind of freedom and development of capital market, development of deep tech labor force, infrastructure. But to be honest, the American experiment that we're now going through is clearly a huge opportunity for Spain, for Europe. Because in some sense, that brain drain that I think was very systematic. People would go to great American universities, they get their, then their the H-1B, and then then all of a sudden they found a firm, they get a green card, whatever it would be. That whole system was a break on European and Spanish entrepreneurial ecosystem. And so the first is that you have this opportunity to leverage the diaspora and to focus in. And the second is, I think, the Draghi report, for those of you who paid attention to that last year, really put the the challenge on the European competitiveness is that if Europe does not figure out how to grow scale-up firms, Europe will have to make choices that it is very uncomfortable with. It will not be able to achieve the goals it has set for itself. And so that means that you have to be willing to think of new ways, whether or not that's a different and maybe more experimental type of regulation, whether or not that is more encouraging to startups, for example, through procurement, right? Maybe, right? So right now, if you're the government, the easiest thing is to go to the big consulting companies to get your IT systems. We've had many examples now, and if you look in MENA, in Middle East, almost all of them use government procurement as a tool to enable early stage startup experimentation. They're willing to fail in the government system so they can encourage the learning and experimentation that needs to get done there in order to scale.
So basically, if I summarize all those great insights, is that this is a huge opportunity for our ecosystem to invest on entrepreneurs. So let's use this opportunity.
And then the last part is you said it was ecosystems are not at the level of Europe, they're regional, right? They tend to be regional entities. And some of the work that we've done in REAP, I think has, because we've worked now with probably 30 or 40 different European regions, and many of them have had these impactful things. Focusing in on competing, and you said this earlier today, competing on the basis of what makes you valuable, of what's unique. Madrid is a great historical city, is a great center for corporate, one of the great links to Latin America, and all those competitive advantages can be the source of a wave of innovation entrepreneurship and scale-ups that don't depend on the United States. And I think that's the path forward. Hopefully as well, we'll have an election next year in the United States, and we'll see how it goes. Okay.
You mentioned corporations, and Spain has very strong, large corporations. What are some of the learnings from your book for corporations?
So my sense is, particularly European large corporations, so I'm going to make a distinction. Some companies are large just because they're large, and what I mean by that is, they're a state monopoly in telephone or something like that. But for private sector large enterprises, established organizations that are usually the leader in their market for good reason. In that world, my experience with students over a long period of time is that those companies find it very challenging to innovate, to develop new product lines that really make a difference. But interestingly, many of them, once you give some freedom to teams to meaningfully, kind of have a small firm in a large firm, if you see what I'm saying, corporate venture capital, each of those are approaches that what we sometimes call intrapreneurship, are very powerful mechanisms if they're managed well. And so you have to put as much resources into managing the chaos, if you see what I'm saying, as you might for a more traditional investment plan or kind of strategy rollout to the next geography or whatever it would be.
And that actually applies to my experience teaching executive MBAs. They work in big companies, and what they're trying to figure out is better methods to develop new products, new business units, and they have to think as entrepreneurs. So you're saying, so that's how this framework can also be very useful to them.
I will say we had an executive MBA who was from the energy, a student was from Houston and was, fairly senior, right at one of the largest energy companies in the world. And he was presenting to the board. I'm not sure if it was quite the board, but it was sort of, essentially the C-suite. And he used the framework in this for basically the overall strategy for. To be honest, when we wrote this book, I cared about entrepreneurs. That was my main focus. I felt like big firms have a lot of strategy. Mike Porter, good, right? That's a joke between Mercedes and I. Since
it's our mentor.
He was our great collaborator, right? And so I've said, let's give a chance to the entrepreneurs to get strategy. But what we found is that the specifics and really taking that experimental approach, validating hypotheses, breaking things down, is a very powerful engine even in the most established enterprises.
I receive a lot of questions from the crowd. So I'm going to choose now in the last 5 minutes I have, like two I have here with me. One, Juan Pedro Fernandez, he asked, what are the skills needed for the entrepreneur of the future?
Yep.
So think of the entrepreneur 10 years from now. What are the skills they need?
So I would say 3. So the first is, kind of when should you become an entrepreneur? We didn't really talk about that today, but we have a whole chapter in the book and a whole framework. You should have passion for the idea. You should have an idea. You should be able to, be clear that there is some, you don't have to really worry about profitability at the beginning, but you should say, I think there's a problem to be solved, or I think I could create value for other people. You should care about it. You should have passion. But you should have also why you. What's your, what we call unfair advantage, which is a term we took from Chris Sacca, the venture capitalist. And what unfair advantage, though, is something you can invest in. So when Michael Martin at Rapid SOS, right, when he started Rapid SOS, he knew nothing about emergency response, and people said, stay in your swim lane. But rather than go to private equity between his first and second year of MBA, he took his father's Prius and visited 300 911 centers around the United States. Did 300 different interviews, right, understanding the problem. And by the end of that, he wasn't the world's leading expert, but boy, he knew a lot more than almost everybody else. And then he combined that with his managerial expertise, and he got that core. So the first is know what you're, build and invest in your unfair advantage. You should be able to say why you for this venture. Second is team. Our best evidence is that entrepreneurial teams are more successful than sole founders, right? Even for kind of equivalent background and kind of general idea. And that's because of 2 reasons. The first is that the great thing about having a co-founder is that you have different skills, complementary, but also it keeps you honest. Having somebody to talk to. It's very hard in life to have people you trust for whom you also trust their judgment. Right? That's true in life and it's true in business, right? Most people you trust, trusting people and trusting their judgment are slightly different things. And finding those people in your life is incredibly important. And the third, I know this sounds like very glib, but is AI. AI is transforming. We now have a very effective tool that takes this entire book and lets you play with it, using a generative AI. That technology is only getting better. If you develop reps, develop a rhythm of learning today of how you are going to take advantage and assist with generative AI and other forms of artificial intelligence. And that's the more fourth thing, if that's okay if I get one more?
Of course.
Right? Is more generally practice. So I will tell you the worst class I ever probably taught, single class session, was I once did an exercise on ideation. Right? Try to get a bunch of business school students to come up and, understand their feelings and kind of very soft skill kind of thing, and they hated it. They really, I tell you, they really hated it. They were like, Scott, we love you, but this is really bad. But then what was interesting was I thought about that, and Erin and I were teaching that together, and we took the time to figure out that what people need to do is practice. If you are uncomfortable, I don't have a good idea, or I don't know how to do experiments, or I don't know how to do sales. Find those, right? Figure out what you're weak at right now. And try to figure out whether or not it's in your current job, whether or not it's in helping one of your friends, but develop a rhythm of practice that allows you to develop that new skill and capability at low opportunity cost so that it's deployable and you actually are confident in it going forward.
And I have to, by the way, emphasize how many good questions are sending me. And I promise you I will share them with Professor Scott Stern afterwards. But I'll choose a very final one, but with a very quick answer, since it's already 8:30. Beatriz Mendez asks, what can the government do to improve entrepreneurial innovation ecosystem? In a few words, what can the Spanish government do?
No one is in charge. If the government understood that one point, everything else is details. No one is in charge of innovation or entrepreneurship. Government can enable, government can be assistive, government can be wonderful at helping to set the table, at convening occasionally if they are a trust body, right? But they are not the ones doing the innovating or scaling the technology. We heard from an entrepreneur earlier last night where for several years public sector said, oh, we are encouraging startups. Once the innovators had come in her domain and they had developed a good solution, they said now it needs to be open source and from the government. So no market. That's poisonous. Right? It's a poison. Because what that means is that entrepreneur now goes, tells all of her friends, and says, the government's completely useless in this. And so government plays an incredibly important role when it's effective. But the first is a change in mindset of no one is in charge of innovation or entrepreneurship. Each stakeholder makes a difference, each stakeholder is critical, but ultimately the work of the system is done by those entrepreneurs and innovators.
I think that's the best way possible to end this dialogue and this conference. So let me thank Professor Scott Stern.
And thank you, Mercedes, and thank you to the Foundation.
And
thank you so much.
I will also like to thank the Fundación Rafael del Pino because they have so many initiatives to promote innovation, entrepreneurship, including this one, including also that we're celebrating 10 years of the Frontiers of Innovation and Entrepreneurship program in collaboration with MIT. So big thanks for the leadership you show to improve the innovation ecosystem of Spain. So thank you again, and thank you to the participants.
Thank you to all, yeah, great question.